Jolan True, to Rick here. This is another video exploring the pre-Federation times based on the apocryphal content of the era, specifically concerning the Romulan War and the Star Empire tactics during this early time. Starfleet and the coalition of planets did not do so great. I've already mentioned how the Vulcans immediately chose to recluse themselves from the conflicts, instead focusing on support. This put greater strain on Tellar and Andoria to pick up the slack, and all the while Starfleet was the primary target and human colonies the focus of most of the Romulans' attacks. The Vulcans had supplied a warp detection grid around coalition colonies, but this really didn't help, as within months of their deployment, the Romulans had found a way to circumnavigate these in a strategy so conniving, so dastardly, that no Vulcan, human, Andorian or Tellarite discovered it for 8 months. The Romulans didn't approach the warp detection grid at warp speeds. Dun dun dun! Just veering away for a sec, this is a really odd choice as a story beat, as I think it makes the Coalition look really dumb. Like, how do you avoid a speed camera? You slow down. How are the Romulans avoiding our warp detection grid? They're not using warp, it's literally the first thing that occurs, surely. Anyway, the Romulans would routinely approach a defended colony world at warp outside of its detection grid in a large carrier vessel. Then they would drop out of warp, out of range of the detection field, and deploy sublight fighters. These tiny ships, often 1 or only 2 crewed, would then approach the grid and systematically begin to disable it enough to open a hole. Their work done, they'd return to the mothership, which would then warp on through to the home colony. This gave a slight warning in the form of a destabilisation of the grid, but it was far more subtle than setting it all off, and it was still enough of an advantage for the Romulans to close in on their target before a defence could be scrambled. The other tactic was to simply coast across in a powered-down warbird. This tactic is later repeated by the warbird that turns up in TOS Balance of Terror by a warpless Talis vessel. This sort of stealth attack resulted in successful ambushes against unprepared colonies at Tarad 9, Deneva, Threlvia 5, Berengaria and Altair 6. After these repeated failures, Starfleet pulled back some ships, including the Enterprise, to conduct tests at infiltrating Earth's detection grid. It was Malcolm Reed who first realised that you could stealthily approach the detection grid satellites and deactivate them. Just in time too, as 2 days later, March the 10th, 2156, the detection grid around Andoria fluctuated in the same way, and sure enough, Romulans had reached Andor. A defence was mobilised and discovered the Romulans in the act of making a hole in the grid, so the Star Empire ships abandoned stealth and warped past the perimeter guard to attack Andoria. On top of this, the Romulans then managed to successfully deploy their remote hijacking weapon on an NX-class starship, the 03 Challenger. This was the first successful hijacking of such a vessel, and until now Starfleet had assumed its vessels resistant to such a takeover. The Romulans used the Challenger alongside their mothership to lock on to Andorian cities, so the NX-3 self-destructed, taking out the Romulan ship 2 and to protect their allied planet. This left Earth with only 2 NX ships. Earlier in the war, November the 8th, 2155, the new NX-04 Discovery responded to the sneak attack on Berengaria and their destruction of Starbase 1. The Romulans here had deployed a second tactic, one first alluded to by Spock in Balance of Terror, and that was the deployment of an atomic weapon. Now, starship hulls are made from duranium, which is easily able to resist a nuclear blast. On top of this, they are insulated against background radiation, so nukes are pretty much outdated weapons. What they could do, however, was blind vessels temporarily, like a flashbang. Unlike a plasma or photon torpedo, a drifting nuclear device was hard to detect and no bigger than space debris that navigational deflectors could sweep aside. It was innocuous enough to make it very close to a vessel. So, the Romulans would let one drift towards an enemy ship while facing off against them, then remotely detonate it when it was right in front of the vessel. Such an EM-charged explosion would white out the sensors of a vessel for a few seconds, leaving them unable to then target the smaller and more manoeuvrable fighters, as they could tear the target apart. So that is what happened to the Discovery. As for the hijacking weapon, this took a really long time to counter and resulted in the loss of many ships across the Coalition. Generally, the tactic from the Romulans was to see what ship they were engaging, and if it wasn't Starfleet, they didn't have to worry. One transmitted code later, and the enemy vessel's main computer was slaved to the attacking warbird. From there, if they had time, they could shut down life support, then board the vessel to capture it, or use it to attack others. Often, however, with the last actions, a tele-captured ship would self-destruct. This was the fate of the Tellarite vessel, the TCS Miract, at the Battle of Geneva in 2155, and the Andorian Imperial Guard ship, the Kathleen Crotus, near the Threlvia system. In the background to all of this was the race for a Warp 7 engine, with the Romulans hard at work across several worlds to develop a faster vessel. On the subject matter of faster vessels, Starfleet's main ships of this time were the NX class, which were lost at a faster rate than they could be built, the Warp Deltas, which were only really suitable for patrols, and the ageing Daedalus and Intrepid classes. Construction of the Intrepid had ceased with the launch of the NX-01, and the Daedalus was too slow to really respond to the Romulan ambush tactics. However, construction of the older vessels was 3 times less resource intensive than a single NX, so Starfleet shipyards constantly churned them out. So, Starfleet had a dilemma: spend time making more effective NX classes, or churn out cannon fodder at a faster rate in order to get more ships. This was the status quo for the first 4 months of the war, right up until some bright spark thought, hey, why can't we just tweak the Daedalus to hold in NX-style warp core? Again, stellar thinking on behalf of Starfleet. Only took them 4 months to think about that workaround, and a further 4 to implement it. It's amazing humans aren't all speaking Romulan by Kirk's era. So yeah, in the early skirmishes, Starfleet wasn't doing so great, at least as depicted in the Romulan War series of books. However, a lot of this seems to be based on its own behaviour, not adapting fast enough to the Romulan tactics, not creating adequate counters or taking the offensive, and being generally slow on the uptake. Contrast this to the Star Empire, that alongside being the aggressors, were constantly leveraging weaknesses of the Coalition and only perfected their tactics the longer the holes remained unplugged. So thanks for watching this video on Romulan strategy during the Earth-Romulan War, and I look forward to producing more breakdowns of extra-canonical stories that not everyone has experienced. So, thanks again, and almost back to normal in terms of video production here, so until next time, goodbye.